Now I'd like to introduce our presenter. His name is Tom Watts, and he is the lead interactive web designer from UC Davis Strategic Communications. So please join me in welcoming him. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Megan, for inviting me here. I'm sure half of your brain is into Saturday. We're going to wrestle the other half back into the work week and berate it with infographics. But I am excited to talk to you guys about this. It's a subject I've talked about a couple of times before, and it's been a big part of my career, translating data, difficult information into visually stimulating content. So the first thing I'd like to just talk about is, it's funny when you ask somebody what they think an infographic is. So I always just go to the definition, which is very broad, right? So the definition, a visual image such as a chart or diagram used to represent information or data. So usually they're thinking either of this, a typical infographic you'd see in a magazine or a newspaper or online and social media, or this, which is a graph. They're both infographics. So there isn't a huge difference between the two. Obviously the style is different and the way they're presenting information is different, but they're accomplishing the same goal. So these two things are essentially both the same. The first thing I always try and get to when somebody comes to present, the idea of an infographic to me is it the right tool for the job? And may the fourth be with you. Spoiler alert, it's probably not. And that is just because they are a very high maintenance deal. And so they're kind of like the panda, like our humble panda here that, needs like 8 billion pounds of bamboo to survive and can't be in above a certain amount of temperature. They're very high maintenance, and so they're hard to maintain, and there's only a small portion of the world that they can live in without dying. So infographics are kind of like that, right? There's a lot of hurdles you kind of have to jump over to get them to work. The first and most important bit of it is who's your audience. Now this is something from my childhood. I don't know why I pulled this picture, but the idea is there's this mystery audience out there, right? And a lot of times people launch into content generation or a website or a research paper or anything they're putting out there, and they don't even consider the audience, right? They're like, I'm working on this thing. It's this thing I'm making. And they forget all about who they're showing it to. And so whether you're making an infographic or writing a piece of literature or anything you're putting together, you have to know who that audience is. Surprise, it's not you, right? Here's Narcissus looking at himself in the reflection. You have to remember that, right? So like you may love this thing you're making, but you have to make sure that the other people that you're showing it to are going to like it. Or that at least it'll communicate information that you want to get across to those people. And the other thing about your audience is you're going to have probably multiple audiences, right? So there could be, one primary audience and then another secondary audience. And you may have, people have any number of audiences. You think of a large company, they have, they could have potentially thousands of different audiences that they have to appeal to. The best way to look at it is you're going to take your primary audience and please them first, and then kind of go down the line that way. So think about that before you even create this thing. Like, who am I showing it to? Is, this the more appropriate version, or is this the more appropriate version, right? So you're thinking back to, who's going to be digesting this thing. One way to discover that information, if you're presenting this on the web or you have a web presence, you can use Google Analytics to do all kinds of wizardry to kind of determine who your primary audience is. I will not go in that today because it could take 3 hours to go down that route. But there's lots of documentation to follow, and we also have an expert in-house, Adam Napolitan, my boss. So if you ever really need to find out who's visiting your website, come and see us. SurveyMonkey is another way to do it. So if you have like a email list or something like that you have access to, that you can send a link to folks and get it out in front of people, you can actually survey your audience to determine kind of what kind of things they'd be interested in seeing. So those are two kind of the ways. There's a number of other ways to determine that stuff, but it is important to think about it. So once you've kind of determined your audience, you need to make sure that what you're creating for them is interesting to them, right? So, I get a lot of requests in, we have a lot of news stories in strategic communications, and people will come to us and say, well, we have this kind of wonky thing that's really hard to describe and not super interesting. Make it an infographic, that'll spice it up, right? That doesn't work that way, right? We can make the most beautiful infographic of all time, But if it's boring, its information is still not going to be interesting. You can make it colorful and do all the tricks, but again, unless it's interesting, it's not really going to be useful to your audience. The first and the easiest way to make something interesting, so this is one of those tricks to put lipstick on a pig, is to make it colorful, right? So I was speaking with somebody who worked in research for a long time the other day, and he said that he was working for a professor who didn't want to use any color on any of his visuals because he felt like it was going to, prove that it wasn't a legitimate scientific document, right? If it was colorful and enjoyable to look at, it should just be numbers and data. And obviously, that's not where you want to be. You want to be somewhere in between that and this, which is way too much color. They've used they have a theme at least, it's pastels, but I think they've used every pastel in the entire world for this document. And you can see just by looking at this that when you use this much color, it makes it really difficult to focus, right? You don't know where to look. And so, the two things that guide your audience through any infographic is going to be color and composition. So, the first thing is color. That's relatively easy, and I'll show you some tools that will get you there. Composition's a little harder. Composition takes years of training, right? So there's only so much help you can get with that. There are things we'll talk about a little later that will help with that. But a lot of people come to this presentation and they think they're going to be a graphic designer by the time they leave. That's not exactly how it works. We'll get you as close as we can, and if you have some of that skill already, you'll be even closer. So this is an example of a better use of color, right? So this is what we call a controlled color palette. They picked a group of harmonious colors to put together. This is just a template of somebody's infographic, but it does a good job of just keeping it confined. It's interesting. It shows you focus. Obviously, probably in this graph, your most important information would be this big circle graph, but it gives a nice harmonious look without being, overwhelming. Tools you can use for that, there's a couple, there's actually a million websites, but these are the top three as far as I'm concerned. Color Hunt is great, Color Lovers is great. These are both UK websites. I don't know, they love palette websites. But what those do is they show you like groups of 3 or 4 colors that work really well together. And so you can just say, okay, I have this graph, it's black and white. I can use this color palette to kind of like drive my infographic. What's nice about the coloradobe.com website is you can actually look at palettes but also make your own. So they have like a little color tool, and you can determine what colors you might like, or if you like a palette a lot but one of the colors isn't really talking to you, so you want to change that one, you could do it with that tool.
So Tom, question,
Sure.
The first one, is that M in CO or?
Yeah, that's a .co. Yeah.
And then you were talking too fast.
Oh, sorry. If I skim over anything, let me know. It's been a while since I presented. Okay, so any questions about any of that stuff so far? Okay, cool. Another tool that is used in a lot, everything under the sun for content are personas. This is used in marketing all over the world, but and it can be very formalized. But for you guys, I think, I use it all the time. What the idea is you're looking at the content and you may have a general idea of your audience at this point, right? And then you can kind of come up with people in mind, like imagine people. We do it all the time in Stratcom, so we have a bunch of different audiences and we pick out a person in our head that we just invent that represents those people, right? So an example is we have a ton of content that gets a lot of traffic for dog facts. So we run a lot of articles from VetMed and things like that where they're talking about, should you neuter your dog, or what's the best kind of food to make for your dog, and all those kind of things. And so we have this huge interest there. And so when we were redesigning our website, we came out with like Bill the dog owner, right? And we looked at everything out of the lens of Bill the dog owner. Like, what would Bill the dog owner think of this page? Would he like this page, or would he not? Does it matter? Is this where Bill the dog owner would be on our website? So you could do the same thing with an infographic. Who's viewing this? Would Sammy the web developer like this, or would he think this was below him? Like you just kind of invent it, and you don't have to be formal. Like you can go all the way to making documents of writing their name and what they do for a living, and like really go far with it. You don't need to go that far. You can kind of just think about who would be looking at this stuff, and it's really helpful. It really solves that problem of you're looking, you're the only one looking at it. Are you designing it for you? Now that in mind, There are a couple of tools to help you with that. So once you've determined audience and maybe some personas, you can look at, if you have a web presence, especially these two tools, Google Analytics, about that one that can track what people are looking at the most on your web presence. And then Hotjar is a really neat tool that is free as well. They have a paid account, but they have a nice free account. And what that allows you to do is literally record people on your site so you can watch their cursor go around and see what they're looking at. So if you had an infographic on a web page or something like that, you could watch somebody experience that, which is impossible in any other way. Analytics can tell you a lot of numbers, but it can't tell you exactly what somebody's doing, like where are they looking, where do they pause, what are they clicking on, that kind of thing. So Hotjar does that. They also have heat maps, which show you, let's say you have a long infographic, which is really common on the web, how far they get down that infographic. Maybe they don't get all the way to the bottom, maybe they're midway, you can see that information through heat maps. Okay, so for you narcissists that were disappointed that it's not just for you, you can come back. It is a little bit for you. So one of the things that we always do is kind of a smell test internally, like, would I actually be interested in this? Would I care, right? And if you don't and you're producing it, that's generally a bad sign. It doesn't mean that you can't do it. It just means that maybe it needs to be refined, or you maybe need a little more information, or something needs to be added to really give it more interest. And then, obviously, it's okay if you don't like it if you've surveyed some people and they really like it. So you have to keep that in mind too. Like a lot of times you have to change style for your personal audience. When I redesigned the home site for the university, we're designing for 17-year-old kids for the most part, because they're mostly prospective students. So I had to take my brain out and say, what a 17-year-old kid like? Oh, this is a lot of color. Well, they like that. I wouldn't like as much of that, but you have to kind of take yourself out of the equation sometimes as well. The simpler the concept, the better. My design philosophy personally is big and simple. Like, just make it as big and simple as possible. There's really you can't go wrong if you do that, because those kind of things just become more digestible for people to see. And I know that's an issue with research, because you have a lot of dense stuff and it can be challenging to do that. What I would advise in that case is to pull out key trends in your research and show those as the infographic. It might not tell the entire story, but it's going to tell a part of the story, and that's going to be digestible to your audience, so it will be easier for them to understand. This is the Affordable Care Act as an infographic. Obviously a complicated process, not a great infographic, right? Like, where do you look? They've broken many of the rules that we'll talk about in a second, but overall it's just way too complicated to show in an infographic. So you have to remember that. Like, you might even, and this has happened to me in the past, I've gotten into a concept, I've fleshed it out about halfway, and then I realized, this is too much, right? There's too much here, it's going to be too hard to follow. So that's just an example of that. Now this is just a simple version, right? So this is an infographic on infographics. It just talks about they pulled out a couple of interesting facts and put them in simple charts. They've used a relatively confined color palette. There's color on here, but it's not everywhere. And you can kind of take these little portions and digest them individually, which is kind of nice. And we'll talk about how, if you're doing anything that's getting up on the web, that can be beneficial as well. Any questions so far? Oh, good. Okay, sorry. So once you've figured all of that out, you've got your audience, you know where you want to put it, you've got an idea of the colors you want to use and the style you want to use and all that kind of thing. You need to make sure that the content that you're actually producing is visually translatable. And I think a lot of you probably have experience with this. Like, if it's, the first one's always, is it graphable, right? So this is my favorite graph, the rabbit duck graph. So the further you go up, it's a rabbit. The further you go this way, it's a duck. But if something is graphable, then you already know that you can make an infographic out of it. It's up to you how you want to represent that graphable data. You can put it in a graph, a simple, this stable, XY graph, or you can do something else which takes a little more, time and effort. But at least it's something that's data that's graphable or information that's graphable. This is a good example of what somebody did. This is the House of Representatives from a couple years back, and what it is a comparison of the existing House of Representatives and what the demographics of that are versus what it would be if it was reflecting the demographics of the country. And so, they don't have a ton of information on here, but it very quickly tells you it tells you the story that these aren't the same, right? You can pretty much immediately determine that. There's little other information that you can find on the edges, which is, just added value. But the main narrative of this is they're not the same. They and the story this person is telling is that they should be the same, and they're not. So that's, a quick basic on narrative, which we'll talk about in a minute as well. Here's another one that's kind of innovative. So it's not actually a bar graph. It looks like a bar graph, but it's a timeline, and they're the greatest bankruptcies in history as represented by sinking ships, right? Which is just a creative way to bring, they could have made a bar graph, or they could have just listed them in a timeline that would have been kind of boring, but they got a little creative with it, and they even have a key of the size of the bankruptcy based on the ship at the bottom. So there's any number of things you can do. You can have that XY, you can do something like this. It really comes down to, in my experience, the amount of time you have and the amount of creativity you want to put into the project. And also, the requirements that your audience have, right? So if you're in a really competitive audience environment, you're probably going to need to do something more creative to drive interest. If you just have the XY in a competitive environment where there's other infographics or graphs presented, you're not going to want to do the same old thing. Okay, so another one that's a really great thing is it a process? A process is really easy to turn into infographics. This is a really basic example, right? They just have a 5-step process about what should be done if somebody gets injured at work, right? And it takes you through each step, and it's very linear. There's no real confusion. It's modular as well, which we'll talk about is an advantage, and it's using color in an effective manner without it being overwhelming. Another good example of a process, timelines are actually kind of a process, right? So it's over time what's happening. This is another timeline using a nice confined color palette. There's a lot of text on here, which we'll talk about as kind of a disadvantage in the future, but it does communicate I think it's the productivity as determined by technological innovation or something. I think that's how it goes on this one. But it does provide a narrative. It does show you contextual things that make sense to most audiences. So it's really an effective way to create an infographic. Okay, another thing we just talked about earlier, does it tell a story? So most content, whether it's an article we post on our site or a research paper that you're putting in front of a reviewer, it has a narrative, right? Everything does. So if it doesn't have a narrative, if you had done research and you didn't find out anything new, then it wouldn't be worth putting in front of anybody. And that's the same thing we try and do with our content. And infographics are the same. So you want to tell some sort of narrative. There's a bunch of different styles of that. These are two simple ones. This one is just a linear narrative, right? So it's literally another infographic about telling a story. So this one's about the narrative, and it walks you through a linear kind of process on the best way to do that. Again, there's a lot of text on this one. There's a lot of text on this one too. We'll talk about why that's a challenge in the next little bit, but don't think too much into that. You don't want to. One thing we found a lot with folks that come in to kind of propose these infographics is they want an infographic, but they want like 15 paragraphs of content in that infographic. And at that point, you should just write the article and maybe put some pictures in it to make it interesting. But it's really not an infographic at that point. One thing that is interesting about this, so we have the linear style here. This is a fact compilation style infographic. What's cool about this is even though these are just a bunch of random facts collected together, they're about the logistics of the 2012 London Olympic Games, they are put together in a way that tells a narrative. And so if you read through these, it talks about 10 million liters of water used per day and how many, 1 cow per athlete and all these different things. But what it tells you, the narrative of this fact compilation is that it's really hard to put an Olympic Games on. It's complicated logistics, right? If it was like 3 things that were really simple, you'd say, well, it's really easy to do that. I could make the Olympics happen. So there are narratives even in these non-linear kind of fact compilation infographics. And again, the use of the color on here, I'll point out again, is nice and controlled. It focuses you on certain ones. Another thing you can use, I saw a lot of questions about kind of techniques and layout and things like that. Again, it's really complicated, but you can use color like we've been talking about and also scale, right? So they pulled certain facts out to be bigger, like the 2000 newts really pops, and it's using the red as well. And so it's, certain colors pop a little more than others. Warm colors tend to come forward, cool colors tend to go backward. So if you have something that you really want to be pulled forward into the information and you have a warm color in your palette, use that color. Again, warm colors are red, orange, yellow. Cool colors are green, blue, gray, those kind of things. Does it show key trends? So especially in research, you're going to have some delta, right? There's going to be some change, hopefully. If there isn't, then you've got to go back and start over. But you want to make sure and show those things. So if you put an infographic together and you're not showing the key trends in that infographic, you want to take a step back and look at what you're doing again. So you want to say, okay, yeah, I have this overall narrative again of what my research was, but I want these 4 things to be pulled out because they're really important to understand the larger story. This is just an example of a trend. So this is the temperature anomaly from the past 140 years in comparison to CO2 in parts per million in the atmosphere. So those are 2 coupled into the same graph, and we'll talk about how the techniques on that to make sure you don't show bias or anything like that. But it's just showing the trend, right? Obviously, both are going up. Whether those are connected or not is up to you, but they're both going up. And that would be the general trend of, say, it could be on an article. This is actually present on our Science and Climate website. So we're telling the narrative that we believe these 2 things are connected. We just talked about visual bias a little bit ago. You want to make, visual bias is an interesting thing in infographics. That same person I was talking to earlier was talking about the colors. One of the other reasons they want to show any color on there was they didn't want to show any bias in their work, right? They didn't want anyone to say, oh, you made that line red, so that's why people think that. And it's like, well, no, if you just look at the data, the data shows you what it is. But that can get a little complicated, right? So these 2 graphs are the same data, right? The only difference is the scale of the Y on this side versus that side. And so, you could argue, well, that one's misleading, or you could argue that this one's misleading. The truth is they're both kind of misleading. What you'd want to do is probably be somewhere in the middle of that, right? So you have it, there's a change happening, there's a delta happening. It's probably not as dramatic as it shows here, but again, that's up to you as the creator of this information, what you feel is the appropriate, level of change to show. The other thing is just, is it the best way to communicate with the audience? Are there other options? There might be other options that you haven't thought of ways to communicate this information that might just be easier for them to digest. Because people get kind of caught up in the process, like, oh, look at this amazing infographic I made, I'm so proud of myself. Well, that's great if it's communicating information. If it's not really doing that, then you made a pretty picture. It doesn't do the job it's supposed to do. One of the things that can be really helpful if you're trying to determine whether something should be an infographic is will it end up being really useful to the folks you're showing it to. One that I always reference is the psychology of color. Everyone in our office has this thing somewhere on their machine, so they can go look it up, just in case. Oh yeah, red isn't a good thing to use for this, or yellow means this. I mean, it's a little bit horoscopy in my personal opinion, but it's just a useful thing that somebody can keep around. So if you have an infographic that you could put together that is part of your story that could be useful for somebody to keep referencing, right? That's always good because they're going to keep referencing that, and if it's put together in some other bundle of your content, they're going to keep seeing your content over and over again as well, which we call in our office evergreen content, right? So something is you're going to keep referencing it for your day, the foreseeable future until you find something different. It's evergreen content. That person wants to remember whether it was good to neuter their dog or what age. They keep coming back to our article, and we see that kind of stuff all the time. Okay, so your infographic has survived the gauntlet that we put it through so far. It tells a story. It's using good color. You know your audience. You've checked all the boxes. There's more to do. So you have to figure out where it's going to go, right? Where are you going to put this thing? So this is the tree from Christmas Vacation, right? They pull the 20-foot Doug fir out of the forest and they try and cram it into their house and it doesn't work, right? That can be the case with infographics as well. You want to make sure you're not putting the 20-foot tree in your living room. So my favorite for infographics are posters because there are no limits. You can do anything you want. You can make them 9 feet tall if you want. They can be on the side of a building. You have plenty of room. You can do all kinds of stuff. You can show any number of illustrations can be coupled with them, and colors and anything. So they are typically the best for infographics. Now, they're also the least used, right? People don't, I don't know how many of you guys will be using them, but they are great. Magazines are also great. Again, you have less room, but at least you know the size of what generally people are going to be looking at it. You're going to know it's 20 by this, or it's the middle of the centerfold of the magazine. I can make it this size. You're gonna have access to that. This one is the space journeys that we have taken as a species through our solar system, which is a really beautiful thing. It is a little hard to read, but again, if you have a captive audience in a magazine, that's where the context is really important. I'm looking at the magazine. I've taken the time to either buy this magazine or read it. I'll read these little descriptions and find out exactly what it's describing here. Now, if this is on the web, it'd be much harder for somebody on the web to kind of digest this. So it's really important to remember where you're putting it. Okay, so I saw some questions about social media. Social media is okay. Generally, the way these things are shared on social media is as some sort of image or PDF, which is fine. The big upside to it is that it's shareable. So now you can take this thing that you think is really important or to your audience, or that you've seen yourself, and you can share it with any number of people. It's exponential on social media. There was a question on whether you could put it on Twitter. The only really way to put it on Twitter would be if it was an image on Twitter. You can't actually put graphical data in any kind of interactive way on Twitter, but you could put the image, and if it's simple enough, it will still be viewable there. The other thing you can do is say, hey, I saw this amazing infographic about, the Delta smelt, and you can put it together, and you can put a link to that on a website, right? So you could link at the bottom and send them to a page that has the full image, or an interactive page, or whatever you create. The web is a mess. So the web is the worst for these things, and only because the web, as you have probably no doubt noticed, is different for everybody, right? So some people are on a phone, some people are on their desktop, some people have an old monitor, some people have a new monitor, some people have the giant, super awesome Apple monitor. You never know how people are going to view these things because of the number of devices that access the web. That doesn't mean it's impossible. We've done it on our site. But this is what everybody thinks they're going to get on the web, right? Like, it's going to be amazing. It's going to be interactive. It's going to do all this stuff, and people are going to be, blown away by it. But this isn't what you get. You get this, right? You get these tiny little viewports that people see things through, and you have to remember that it's this aspect ratio on a phone, on a desktop, but on a phone it's the opposite, right? But maybe somebody turned the phone that way. So it's just so hard because you're never really going to know exactly how people are going to view it. So what you do is create a modular design. You're going to have to take this grand idea of your infographic, and you're going to have to cut it up into pieces. It doesn't mean it's always going to be cut up into pieces. It just means that you have it available to be moved. And so the way we did that is this was the grand design of the infographic. We were just presenting some really simple information about the university. But what these are is this is an image, this is an image, that's an image, that's an image, and this is an image. So when you take it to a phone, it just goes vertical down the page. So it's adjustable to how somebody's viewing it. We're able to do this through a bunch of, it's way too complicated to explain right now, but this isn't only because we use a CMS. If you're using a normal website, and actually if anyone's using SiteFarm in here, this technology is available in SiteFarm. All it is you're putting them in this little grid, and the grid has rules, and the grid will follow the rules if you put the images in the right location. So this, if you are using SiteFarm, which I think everybody's going to be moving towards at some point, you will have this available to you. It's really easy. It's called Sibling Grid, I think, in SiteFarm. The other thing we talked about a little earlier is the text, right? So we looked at a couple of infographics that had paragraphs of small text or really small labels coupled with larger text and things like that. You want to avoid the small text because you're going to need that text, especially if it's on the web, or a messy web, to be visible all the way down to a phone, right? So if If it's on, we were able to do that for that modular design, right? So we actually didn't even change the size of the text between these two things. We just moved the pieces. But a lot of times you're going to have, if it's one large image, let's say we had made this just one big piece. On a phone, it's just going to shrink the whole thing down, right? So all that text in here is going to become pretty much illegible at that point, especially if it's an image, because it won't be a sharp font that's being brought through map onto your phone. So make sure that that's big. So we go back to this one, right? This wouldn't work, right? Even if you'd have to cut it up into all these tiny pieces for it to work, which is possible, I guess. But it would be a challenge. And only because, there are some big pieces of text here that would work just fine, but these little pieces are just definitely not going to work. So you could do this style if you keep the text large. Another example of what we did here, we broke this into quadrants again, and we have big, large text on these, so even if it does get shrunk down a little bit, it just goes vertical and it's still a legible and usable item on the phone. Another thing I saw, a couple folks ask questions about, okay, I want this thing I've created to work well on the web and print and all these options. So one trick to that is using vector graphics. How many people are familiar with vector graphics in here? Just a couple. So basically all the difference is if you have a bitmap's like an image you see on the web, and they're made of pixels, right? So it's just little squares. And when you move them from big to small or large to big, they get distorted and get ugly. You've all seen, images that look grainy or weird on the internet, and it's because they've taken a bitmap image and they moved it all around. So a vector graphic is just math creating this image, right? So it's a lot of illustrations, a lot of flat design is made through these vector illustrations, and that means that it's going to look the same on your desktop as it's going to look on your phone. It'll be just as sharp on a phone, or even if it's printed. So if it's printed, it'll still keep that because it's just rewriting the math at a larger size. It's completely scalable at that point. So if you can keep it to that, that's definitely preferable, because if you just have those if your whole graphic is made of these, which is really easy to do with an infographic generally, then it will be scalable to really any size. So there were requests for some tools. So I'm sure some of you have heard of Tableau. It's kind of the industry standard for creating complex graphics. There is a learning curve with Tableau, and it is not free. So, I think there are some licenses around campus. I don't remember how. I think I heard at one point the whole campus had a license, and then I heard, okay, I think just some departments have them. It is generally worth it if you want to go down that road. It's a really great program. But again, there's a learning curve. I don't even know how to use it. D3 data-driven docs. So this is another thing that is commonly used in research data visualization. It's a JavaScript-based tool. Generally, you're going to need a developer for this. So if you have a developer in your group, they could learn it. Some people, like one of my colleagues, worked in research for a number of years and then moved into development, so he can do it. But it definitely requires some expertise. Chartist is a neat little data visualization tool that's meant for the web. It creates these graphs that you can put into HTML of any kind, and I think even social media in some cases, that are scalable, and they generally work really well on the web. They kind of have to be simple though, so it's not a lot of really complicated information. And again, you probably need somebody who knows a little bit about the web to help you with that. Piktochart is really good. This one is much less, has much less of a learning curve. They have everything from simple charts to flyers that you can create through Piktochart. I've never used the tool personally, but I've heard good things about it. Our social media group uses it a little bit.
I use it to make this flyer and all the other flyers, so it's great, and it's free.
Yeah, it's another. That one's free. Yeah, I think Chartist is free. D3 I think is free. It's just a JavaScript library. So the only one at this point that costs any money is Tableau. But Piktochart is great, and then another one that is really quick and easy and also has a free option is Infogram. So Infogram is really cool because you can put, again, it makes a web-ready graph or infographic, and they have like a icon library and everything that you can like pull some generic icons into to make a more interesting infographic. There's a limit, I think, for the free account. I don't think the paid account's very expensive. It's like $10 a year or something like that. but it gives you a little more, you can put like customized content and some more availability. But I think you can actually go a really long way with just the simple version of this. And this is great because this creates charts that can be viewed on any device, which is really nice.
I think Tableau has a free version called Tableau Public, I think.
Okay, yeah.
It's free for 1 year.
Yeah, I think there's a free trial for students. It's really powerful software, especially for data visualization. Kind of a high learning curve, I would say. I tried using it, and, and then I went to Piktochart. So
Yeah.
that's, yeah.
Yeah, like I said, if you go down the road, you can make some amazing stuff in there. So if you can get it for free, I mean, it might be worth looking into, especially because I think a lot of the heavy lifting as far as the design is taken care of, because you're really just putting, I mean, you had more experience than I probably have, but I think a lot of it is the data is driving it. And that's certainly how a lot of these tools are. Like Infogram, you just put your data in and it makes you a infographic. You pick the style, you pick the colors, and it just produces it for you. So you don't have to do any of the design work. Piktochart has a lot of that stuff as well. I mean, you're better off if you know a little bit and you're doing a little bit of work and looking at what your color palette is and things like that, but it's pretty easy to use.
Another one I would add is Canva, Canva, and it's more designer based, and it has a lot of good templates that you can use. If you're not super design savvy, then you can like build off of the templates.
Another one that I just thought of that we use for user experience design in our department that's free for higher ed is called Figma. It's Figma. It's everything from the stuff you can do in Illustrator, like graphic design, all the way up to web development. But what's really nice about it is really collaborative, so you can just invite somebody to look at your tool or edit it, and you could both be in there at the same time editing. It's really neat. But it's free for higher ed, and it's a really nice tool. And it may not, I mean, I think you could do infographics in there for sure. It also has a ton of, you can make like multiple canvases of different devices, so you can make, oh, this is what it'll look like on a phone, and this is what it'll look like on a site, and really go nuts. It's a pretty nice tool. There was a question in the group of questions about how to get share these and get feedback on them. There's a website called Behance, Behance. It's a graphic designer website where people share like logos and infographics and things like that, and so people get intimidated by it. But there's tons of everyone's on there. So from advanced, really great designers to the starter who's in high school who's just learning the tools. So you could put an infographic on there and get a ton of professional feedback really quickly, and people are really nice on there, and they'll give you help. I'm sure there's trolls like there are on any website, but it's probably the best one if you want kind of a professional review of what you're doing. You can always use us too. We've had people come to us. We had an infographic from I forget the group, but it was about the nitrogen cycle, and so we worked with them on the best way to produce that information and tighten it up. It came to us as this giant thing that was way too complicated for anyone to understand. So yeah, if you ever need help with that kind of thing, I'm available, and our department in general is available. Okay, so my favorite part, the ugly infographics. Okay, so here's one about the odds of different things, and it's basically to try and sell you into this ridiculous contest they're running. But they broke. What rules do we see that are broken in this one? Does anyone want to venture a guess? Color's a great first one, right? You've got a weird use of color. In fact, you can barely read half of it because they haven't got enough contrast between the colors. Anything else? Everything's a good answer. Yeah, the narrative's kind of hard to find. What are the odds is over here, and then they throw you back over here, and they make you read, which, again, we don't want a lot of text. You don't want to redo an article, right? Another one, they use bitmap images here, so you can see how bad these look when they get blown up, right? They get grainy and dark, and they don't do a good job with that. So you want to avoid some of those. This is a bad one. Here's another one. So this is a timeline, which is an acceptable infographic, right? It has a relatively constrained color palette, which is good, but they basically written an article, right? They just made a timeline with a bunch of text, and they put some color and a couple of random clip art images around it, right? And we've all seen these. These come about in a lot of departments on campus. I remember when I first came here to work in admissions, and we had a library of these things. But yeah, you want to avoid just rewriting an article into an infographic. And you know, clip art, you know, people rip on clip art. It's fine if you use it in a contextually appropriate way. It doesn't really matter if the thing is designed at a high level professionally, as long as it's communicating the information, right? And this still doesn't really do that, especially, I mean, imagine trying to look at this on a phone or anything, or even really print it out. It would be kind of rough. Here's another one. Okay, so who wants to venture a couple guesses at what would be wrong with this one? This is U.S. space travel, and this is a manned NASA flights that we've taken over time.
Text and the background color is like almost the same.
Yep, so we got another problem with visibility of the text. Is there a lot of text?
Yeah.
Yeah, right, there's a ton on here. Now this would work okay. I think this might have even come from a magazine. It's okay for a magazine if you had text that was visible maybe. But the other issue is it's really hard, like the narrative's hard to, like this is a beautiful spiral and I like the icons they've used. And it's an example of, it's a nice design, right? But it doesn't really communicate the information very well. Trying to actually follow this and figure out which one is which, like which flight is this, right? Like it's useless. So you can have, and that's where people will say, oh, well, I'm gonna take this information, I'm gonna go to a professional designer, a vendor, I'm gonna pay them, they're gonna make this amazing thing, it's gonna be awesome. You can still end up with something like this that's pretty much useless, you know, even if it's designed well. So this is one of my favorites. This is the opposite end of the spectrum. This is from the Gates Foundation. It's World's Deadliest Animals. What do we like about this one?
Clear linear narrative.
Right? Narrative's pretty obvious right away. What else do we have?
Single color palette.
Very nice color palette, very restricted.
Limited text.
Limited text. And it's just a really, I mean, from a design standpoint, for me, this is really nice because they've taken something, you know, they've got these lines that kind of denote, at first you think it's the actual width of the line, but then as you follow it down, it's the depth of the line. And what's nice about that is that it works at any width, right? So you can smush it down and it still works. You can expand it, it'll still work. This is a great example of content that's really interesting for audiences. It's called, I forget what we have a name for it in our newsroom, but basically it's surprising, right? You expect it to be a wolf or a lion, and in fact, those things don't kill many people at all. It's mosquitoes and tapeworms and snakes and dogs. You know, it's all the things that people aren't actually afraid of most of the time, which is funny.
Question.
Yeah, go ahead.
With the color palette with red, white, and blue, is that like too patriotic, or is that?
No, I mean, I wouldn't worry about that kind of stuff. Like that's thinking a little too hard.
Okay.
Honestly, yeah. Like, and that's where I was talking about the professor was saying, "Well, I'm just going to go black and white because I don't want to have to think about it." I think as long as the colors are harmonious, it does not matter. And again, you don't want to show visual bias either. So if you have like 4 really cold colors and 1 really bright, warm color, unless you want that to be the focus, you know, which is okay if you do that. But if it's not, then you've got visual bias. You're actually showing somebody something that's not there in a weird way. So you just want to be careful with color that way because it can get tricky. That's why I always suggest like pick a palette that's professional design. Go ahead.
So I have a color question as well. So like the established color palettes, do they take into account like red-green color blindness or is?
That's a
or
great
do you
point.
need to really think about that in addition to choosing a professional?
They don't in general. So you would have to kind of take that into consideration. There may be a site that does that. I wouldn't be surprised because there are so many color palette sites. The ADA may have a guide for that kind of thing. So you may want to pick a color palette and then check the guide. I know there are guides online for what combinations are bad from that degree. But yeah, that's a great point. You know, we're always trying to get the ADA stuff right. It's a moving target. It's really difficult. It can be really challenging for designers because it limits you in a lot of ways, but it's worth it in the end because in most cases it's best standard practices anyway. So we try and follow those. Anything else you guys like about this one that pops to you guys?
The colors don't represent anything, right?
No, in this case they don't. It's just there for interest, right? Because this could easily be black and white and still work, which is kind of nice. But it's nicer to have the colors. And that's where I was saying, like, color just is going to drive interest even if it's not used to have any narrative. It's just going to make it more interesting, especially if it's presented in a paper or on a page with other content. You're just going to want it to have some aspect to it that makes it more interesting for folks.
Something nicely scalable, no matter how big or how small it gets, it still has meaning and it's interesting.
Right, and this is actually you could probably create this completely in HTML, so in CSS, so the code would represent it. You might not even have to use an illustration for this. which would be really nice because those are fully scalable in every way, which we always are trying to do because anytime you're making things with code, it's better. But that's challenging for you guys because you're not always going to have the developer on hand to do that with. Okay. All right. So this is the piece of paper that we have. I don't know if we've handed it out or not. But this is the, should this be an infographic? It's cut off there at the top with ours. Oh, there it is. Okay, should this be an infographic? A couple of things are missing because I've added some things since I made this. But it's the basic, this is actually an infographic itself. It's called an information tree or decision tree. So, you use these to decide whether to do something, which way you go. And so we can just walk through this one really, this is a nice simple one. Is the concept complicated? If it is, then it's not a good candidate. If not, you keep kind of going down the decision tree. Is it visually translatable? Is it a graph, a process, a story? Does it have a narrative? No, probably not a good candidate, right? Like if you do research and there's not much delta, you're not going to want to show that in a graph, especially. You might be able to conceal that in text, but it's going to be really hard to conceal in a graph if there's not much delta. Are there better options? There are. Use those. There may be a better way to do it, whether it's represented in a single image or audio or video or any of those other options. You can use that to communicate the information. I don't know how many of you folks use video, but video tends to be a really great way to present some of this information because it's so flexible and scalable and easy to share, right? So it takes nothing to get a YouTube account. It's really easy to use that. It can be challenging. People view it as challenging to produce, but now with phones the way they are, you can get a little bit of equipment like a microphone and a couple of other things for relatively cheap, under $500 total for all of your equipment, and you can make a video as good as anyone can on the internet. So it's not always an option, but if it is, it's a great way to go. We use it a lot. Okay, so then it goes back to, is it useful? Is it that thing people are going to reference? That one's a little challenging. This is kind of a soft yes, no, only because sometimes it's just interesting, It might just be interesting to your audience. It might not be useful down the road to them, but it's something that they might share with somebody in a conversation. I saw this infographic about, the most dangerous animals in the world. It was really crazy. I thought it was lions and it's actually mosquitoes, that kind of thing. So that one's kind of a soft one. I think but again, that's leaning hard on your content being really interesting, right? Which helps. Like if you can sit there and say, okay, if you're starting the process saying, I know my audience and I know that this is really interesting to them, you're like 99% of the way there. You're in good shape. Okay, now this is another one we didn't really talk about. Does it fit the channel? So that's, I'm putting this on the web. Okay, it's this giant, really complicated thing. It's not gonna work, right? Or I'm putting this in a magazine and it's really simple and small. That's not gonna work. Or I wanna share this on Twitter and it's not an image, or it's an image, but when it gets shrunk down to Twitter size, it's too small. It's not going to fit the channel. So always think about where you are, and if it passes all these and it's interesting and all of that, then you go ahead and go through the process of making an infographic. Any questions about kind of this or any of that stuff? Do you have any? Does anyone have people brought stuff they want to talk through, or any questions about their own process or what they should do?
I had a comment from one of the virtual participants going back to the color blindness thing. One participant told me that there's a color blindness simulator you can download on your computer to view everything, color blindness, I guess. It's called colororacle.org, I think. So if you look up Color Oracle, there is a simulator.
That's cool. I will be doing that.
Yeah.
Is there any suggestion on the fonts choice?
You're going to want again, I always lean towards big and simple, like I said. If you have ornate fonts, it's generally a bad idea. People sometimes think that I got to generate interest, so I'm going to use this really fancy looking font. Well, those are generally hard to read. The other issue is you're going to want something that looks good, big and small. So what we generally recommend are sans-serif fonts. What that means is just it doesn't have any decoration. You've seen fonts like the Futura font used on campus or Proxima Nova that's used on campus. Those are sans-serif fonts. It just means it's very plain geometric style font. It doesn't have, good example, right? So there's no decorations on these. It's just a basic line. There's no, I don't remember my typography names for all the different. Times New Roman is a serif font. Yeah, that's a good example. Right, exactly. So you don't want to use that generally. Times New Roman is okay for text, but you're not going to want that in a big graph. You want big, simple stuff you can use. You can get, if you're on campus, you can, Arial is an example of a sans-serif font. Again, it depends on how, if you really want to get into fancy sans-serif fonts and pay for them and all that kind of stuff, that's fine, but really you just need the simple ones. You can use Arial for almost anything for graphical data, especially.
Do you have any tips, knowing my audience, I know that they're too poor to print out color printouts. So they may be printing, is it just a matter of using shades and looking at it in grayscale and color?
Absolutely.
You know, they might,
Yep.
if that's part of the plan.
So a trick I use in my own design, I do a lot of logos, or at least I have in my past career, and I always make them with black and white first. So I can see what it looks like in that manner, because I know people are going to print them out on a laser jet, right? And it's not going to have a color, and they're going to see it that way. So you always want to make sure it's digestible in that form. And really, that's kind of good advice for everyone, even if you know your audience might print out in color. The best way is to see it in black and white, just to see what it looks like in that format. But yeah, I think it was you who mentioned the Bill Gates graphic didn't really need the color. It would work in black and white. Like you could have printed it out and it would work fine. Any questions on layout use? I know that was brought up a lot in the. You guys have any like concerns or issues you faced in the past with that kind of thing, like coming up with compositions? So a couple of things I could throw out there. Generally, you don't want to center things. I don't know if you've heard the rule of thirds for photography, but there's like thirds of the canvas, and you don't want something to be right in the middle. That's generally the least interesting, and it'll drive focus to the subject that's in the middle. But if you have anything on the periphery, it's going to completely be invisible for your audience. So things like that, creating, if you have a page that has maybe text on this side and an infographic over here, and then you want to balance it out with maybe another one over here, you wouldn't want to put something right dead center like this guy. Generally bad practice for a composition. Trying to think of anything else that I could give you guys as far as layout advice. Keep white space as an option. So people tend to think I need to cram this page full of as much information as I can possibly get into this page. What ends up happening when you do that is cognitive overload. So your audience sees it and they can't actually look at it. Like it becomes, you've all seen things like this, right? You've looked at something and I don't know where to put my eyes. It was like the ones with all the colors at the very beginning of this thing. Or that one. Let's see, we got tons of them. That one too. It's pretty common. Well, this is a great example of cognitive overload, right? Like, where do you start? There's no real place to put your eyes. And so if you're putting something together in a research paper, and you want to cram a ton of things into that, and you have let's say you have 3 visuals, you have 3 graphs, or 2 graphs and an infographic or something like that, and you have a decision to make. All right, do I put one at the start, one in the middle, and one at the end, or do I put them all right next to each other? What do you think is the answer to that question? If I had a paper and I had the choice between putting the visuals I have 3 big visuals. I can put one at the beginning, one in the middle, and one at the end, or I can put them right next to each other. What would be the better option for your audience, you think?
Spaced out.
Yeah, you're going to space them out. You put them right next to each other, they're going to have trouble. They might read the first one, they might see that first one, but it's going to be hard to see the rest of them for an average person. They're going to see that first one, and they might read it, and yeah, they might go all the way down, but especially if they're complex, like 3 graphs or something like that, and the data is really dense, it's just going to look like a blur of lines and numbers. It's going to be really hard for somebody to see. But if you took the same complicated visuals and you separated them with some text or even some white space around those things, it would be more digestible. And in fact, you could actually put them together if you put enough white space in between them. But there's always this idea that, okay, I have this visual real estate, I need to put as much as I can into this thing, right? And it's generally a bad idea to do that. People are willing to scroll or read a long document or go to the next page. They'd much rather do that than try and read something that is crammed with information. I mean, you guys know the websites you like the best. It's not the ones that are like overwhelming to your eyes. It's usually the nice, clean, airy kind of sites.
Oh, I think I forgot my question. No. Is there like a rule of thumb about how many things to emphasize in one infographic? And I know it depends on the size, but like, the rule of thumb is like when you're giving a presentation, hit two or three main topics and then keep kind of repeating them, like if you're, educating. So I'm just sort of wondering if, you have a postcard size infographic, you can only do two things, or, is there some sort of a rule of thumb?
I would say on a postcard size, really anything, you're going to want to keep it to under 5 major elements on that. I mean, unless you have a big poster or something, where you have a captive audience, where like this is going to be in a classroom and it's going to be there for 20 years, and everybody who's bored with their teacher is going to stare at this thing, right? They'll read everything you put on there. But if you don't have that, and especially if it's anything that's going to be in any way on the web, you're going to want to keep it under 5 major elements, just because it's hard for, attention spans are so small.
So to kind of add to that, they say that it's really easy to remember and process 3 things, but then your brain takes a huge leap to start processing 4 or more things. So 3 or fewer is ideal, but sometimes you need to get that 4th or 5th point.
Yeah, and what I would advise in that case, so if you have to go beyond 3 and you're into that 4, 5, 6 even, use your scale, to help you. So if you really have one major takeaway, make it bigger than the others. So you make sure they don't, you don't want to get to the point where there's so many that they lose it entirely, which even, 4 or 5, you're probably okay. They're going to see something on there. But you want to make sure it's the thing that you want to, as your major takeaway, put that as the biggest thing on there, or the thing with the brightest color.
I was hoping to go back to your decision tree real quick, and
Sure.
one of the items on it is it useful? And you said, maybe if it's not useful, it's still really interesting, that's good.
Sure.
But can we, from your experience, do you have any examples of things that are useful? Like, what were your goals in doing infographics sometimes?
So, a good example actually is the stuff we did on the website. So we pulled some data. We did a bunch of focus groups and we did some data before we had some of those nice fancy tools, and we knew people needed to know a couple of things about the university. People don't know where Davis is. You've talked to people, I'm sure, in the past, and do you serve every day? No, it's in the valley. So, we knew they wanted to know that. And this is actually a good example because we knew that, right? So we made that the biggest thing. We knew we wanted to show them exactly where it was in a couple of our centers to kind of show that we had a breadth throughout Northern California. But then we coupled that with a couple of just interesting things, right? I mean, you might want to know how many students are there. That's something that's pretty common, but you don't need to know there's 20,000 bicycles on campus a day, right? But it draws you through the infographic. So it's just kind of a little spice to the infographic to get you to keep reading. And the research funding, we didn't get to put, somebody told us to put that one in there. We had to put that one in there. But that, our prospective undergraduates generally don't. I mean, it's interesting, but it's not that interesting for them. But we kind of framed it up with then, adding our kind of Aggie Spirit stuff at the bottom. But yeah, it's, sorry, did I even close to answer your question?
I asked for an example of something that was useful and you talked about. You also kind of brought this up earlier about surveying your audience too.
Yeah, and so, I think the useful one is kind of difficult because useful infographics are like very utilitarian, right? It's something that that your audience needs to deal with, right? So the color one's a good example for the group I work with because there's a bunch of designers and developers in there. So you're working with color all the time and you're having to present about color choices and things like that. So that for us is an incredibly useful infographic. But for half of the guys, most of you guys, it doesn't matter at all. It's not useful at all, right? So it's finding those things that you know to be useful for your audience. It may be, I'm just trying to think of the process of, even if it's something that's just useful to you and you know that your audience are peers, then it's probably somewhat useful. It's just like when you suggest something to somebody in a conversation, I have this website that's great for that. It's the same kind of thing with an infographic, like you're gonna wanna give them that thing that those guys provide, Infographics are challenging if you're trying to make them really useful because they're not really searchable most of the time because they're images. So most people, when they're looking for something now, they just type it into Google and they see what comes up. And you might get an infographic, but you're probably not. You're going to get a page, that gives you the information. So that's something to consider also, especially if you're writing like a blog piece or any kind of scientific communication that's going to be on the web. The infographic isn't going to drive the search traffic. So you have to present something in that is a little different than what might be useful for what your content holds.
Kind of going off of that, are infographics mainly used for introducing novel information, or can they be used more for like a reference to go back and look at it multiple times?
Both, actually. I think, this is something I was talking to somebody about this the other day. A lot of times this comes down to audience stuff. So the best, in my opinion, infographics are something that combine novel information with something that's familiar. That's why you see something like they put the weight in the number of elephants or something like that, right? Because I don't know how many metric tons or something is. I don't know what a metric ton is in my brain, but if I know that it's 20 elephants or whatever it is, then I can understand that. So that's kind of the best combination is you're giving them new information coupled with familiar information. And that's really in my opinion, when you're not a graph, that's the best way to present that stuff, contextually.
If I'm trying to draw things for an infographic, I've noticed I have a lot of difficulty drawing with my mouse. Do you have any sense of tools or software that's out there that's helpful for it?
Yeah, I just saw something today. There was a Reddit thread about the best free websites, and one of them was an icon web. I don't know if Megan knows of it, but it's there's an icon website that has like a giant library of icons. But you could search. I'm sure you could search that. Just Google it.
It's called the Noun Project. There's one I know.
Yeah, there's another one too. I can't remember the one I saw today. It was a separate one, but yeah, I'm familiar with that one as well. So you can actually get a lot of stuff that's already made, and then you don't have to make it. Again, drawing with your mouse is really hard. Usually you're going to have to use a program like Illustrator or there's tons of free programs on the internet you can download to do illustration work.
Right. So my question was, do you have suggestions for free software?
I'm embarrassment of riches on campus. I have access to as much software as I want, so I don't generally use the free stuff. I haven't for years, but the only one I can even think of off the top of my head is GIMP that people use for like Photoshop and stuff like that, like a Photoshop replacement. I don't know if there's an illustration one, but I think you'd be best. Figma is actually not bad. Figma, the program I mentioned earlier, you can use that it has every tool that Illustrator is going to have, and it's free for higher ed. There's a little learning curve on that stuff, but the good news about anything you want to learn is for let's say you really wanted to learn how to use Illustrator. I think you can get most of those programs for free at campus too. So if you're a student, you can get Illustrator for free, or at least really discounted. And there is so much documentation on the web now that if you really wanted to learn that, it probably wouldn't take you very long to really learn how to at least create what you're looking to create. You can even type in I'm trying to create a giraffe in Illustrator, and somebody will video tutorial all the way through it. It's just that's the way the internet is now. It's nuts. But that's what I would suggest. Is kind of do it on a case by case, and then as you do that, if you're using the same tool, you'll just eventually you're going to realize, oh, I know how to use this tool, and I can make these things on demand for myself.
Is Illustrator useful to pair with some kind of electronic pen?
You can. I don't personally do that, but there's plenty of people who do. They get a tablet and they use the tablet. Photoshop also has that pairing. I think any of the Adobe products do. But yeah, it's the challenge with kind of hand-drawn stuff is that, like I said, especially Illustrator it generates math, right? So if you do a hand-drawn curve like that, it's going to make a ton of data points when you do that, right? Versus if you use their tool, it's going to be like 3 data points because they've done all the math already in their tool to make those lines. So in my opinion, it can be a little hard to work with some of those files once you use a tablet to make it because it makes a big file. So now you're working with a bigger file that's kind of clunky and hard to email and share and all that kind of stuff. So it can get a little hard. I would suggest just taking a stab at it, and if you're like, oh, this is not for me, then you look at some of the free tools or get some of the icons that you can get out there. But there's so much stuff now. Compared to when I started to learn this stuff 20 years ago, it's amazing. I wish I had access to all this stuff. But really, what I always tell people, my mom's the one who always does. She'll call me and be like, how do I do this? What? You're my computer resource. I'm like, I'm just graphics, I don't really know, like I don't know everything about the entire internet. But if you just Google it, you will get 70 answers immediately from the best experts in, the universe, essentially, for all this stuff. So I do suggest if you guys get stuck with any of this stuff, even if it's designing infographics, you can find a tutorial to do that stuff.
Tom, before you answer that question, can I bring you over?
Oh,
back to
sorry,
the
too far.
recording?
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem.
And Pixabay, recommended by one of the virtual participants, is a good resource for photos and vectors. Pixabay, Pixabay.
Yeah, that's one of the ones that was on the list. I wish I could remember the icon one. It's
Yeah.
a specific one for the icons.
Yeah,
I'll send it to you.
Used for like icons for like buttons on websites and stuff. On infographics, I've used the Noun project.
Yeah.
Say noun.
The Noun project, like thing. Place.
Noun.
Yeah, Noun.
So I do a lot of work in English and in Spanish, and so is there sort of like a rule? If I'm developing an infographic and I want it to be in both languages, am I necessarily creating two different infographics, or is it okay to put two languages on the same infographic?
I think it's okay as long as you're not in one of those text-heavy infographics, right? Because now you're creating like a double paragraph every time. If you created like a simple one like this where you just have a couple of words, you could easily do that. I think that's fine. I mean, again, it depends on your audience. You don't want to send that to somebody in maybe Alabama or something like that where they're going to yell at you for the next 6 hours. But yeah, it wouldn't be a problem in most places. But that's all about, remembering who you're putting these things in front of, and it can be challenging. We as a university, it's really difficult. We run into all kinds of issues that you would have never thought you would, and it's fine. You just roll with it. So, you're definitely going to probably, if you create any of these, you're going to put them out there, and somebody's going to come back to you with some kind of thing, and it could be completely valid, and you just say, okay, I'll adjust it, or I'll take that into consideration next time.
I got another suggestion online for free icons. Iconarchive.com.
That's it.
There it is.
Yep.
Iconarchive.com. So,
Really quickly, I would say be careful when you Google free anything online. So if you say best free image website, you're going to get spammed. The first 10 responses are going to be gnarly. So just be careful. Try and use a trusted source. It might be like the 10 best or something like that from a trusted source that you know. Like a website or Behance or something like that.
okay, so before we transition to the interactive activity part, let's give a round of applause for our presenter. Thank you, Paul.